All right, my name is Chris Campbell. I'm a practicing CPA and I work with small businesses and individuals to help them pay the least amount of taxes possible while keeping them out of jail. So today I wanted to revisit a topic that I had talked about quite recently regarding my experience in selling a property. And I started to question the current compensation structure for realtors. And I was simply explaining the process that I went through trying to sell my place. And also sure I wound up going with a flat fee broker because when examining the pay structure of a traditional realtor, I felt it was just too much to pay for the value I felt that I was receiving. I asked why the structure was as such, because the traditional 5-6% to realtor fees didn't really make much sense to me. Got a ton of responses from that, and I appreciate that. Some were in support of what I was saying. Some essentially said that I didn't know what I was talking about. That's fine. And some were really trying to explain the process, and I appreciate that. And I wanted to give a rebuttal as far as with some of the explanations that I received. I still feel as though the pricing for what you pay realtors at this point versus the value they provide, I think there's a pretty big gap or difference nowadays. Maybe at one point there wasn't, but I think with the advent of the internet, to me, it's harder to match up the value with what you're paying. And again, this is really just in reference to your traditional brokerage structures, your 5-6% with your run of the mill homes. I had also mentioned on higher end homes or very lower end homes. I think it's probably a bit more justified because it's probably a lot harder to move a lot of those properties. And I'm also eliminating commercial. That's a whole beast. So I'm talking about your middle tier homes, decent condition homes that folks would want to live in. But there were a couple points that I wanted to make regarding some of the comments that I received. And I think the main point here is that I'm a firm believer that everyone should be compensated for their time. And I know that the realtors on both the buying and the selling side, they put in time and they should be compensated as such. My main point that I was just really trying to make here was from selling a home, the buyer's agent should just be compensated directly by the buyer and not taking from what the seller's list decides to pay them. And there are a number of arguments saying that I'm not paying the buyer, it's coming out of the seller's proceeds. But I think it's fair to say that a buyer's agent commission is carved out into commissions that you pay to the listing agent. And feel free to ring in and comment addition if you feel otherwise, but I'm sure that is the case. But I wanted to highlight that the current compensation structure is a bit broken. That's really what I was looking to point out. Because with the current structure, the buyer's agent is inherently not working in the best interest of the buyer. Isn't the buyer's agent main duty is to help the buyer obtain the best house possible, but for the least amount possible? Isn't that part of the negotiation? If that is the case, and if you're serving as a fiduciary for the buyer, I would imagine that those duties would include you trying to get the best deal possible for your buyer. But the problem with the current compensation model is that as a buyer's agent, you get paid based upon the sales price. So the higher the sales price, the more your commission is. So that inherently hits you against your own buyer. So I just really wonder if you go and you ask for a price reduction, how hard are you going to fight for that price reduction? When at the end of the day, if you do that, you're working against yourself because now your compensation gets cut for every dollar less that the place goes for. You're taking money out of your pocket. So you have to wonder how hard you're going to fight for that price reduction. I know people do, but you're bidding against yourself as a listing agent when you're doing that. Again, if the buyer was paying the buyer's agent directly and or having some sort of incentive to get the best deal possible, then you just wouldn't have that. And that way, a buyer's agent could be compensated directly and fairly for their time and not bidding against themselves or being penalized for doing a great job for the client. If I get you a great deal and I got a reduction on the home for my buyer, shouldn't I be paid more for structuring the great deal? But in this case, the current compensation model, you're getting paid less. Again, I think it's just another demonstration of how broken the current compensation model is. Another point that I wanted to point out is with a traditional commission model, the buyer's agent's commission is based upon what the seller's agent decides to give them. And folks, you can comment if I'm getting this wrong, but that seemed to be the case or the argument when I was looking from the comments. So again, I think this creates a system that's quite broken, because if you're a buyer's agent and you're performing services for the buyer, why is it that your compensation is based upon what the seller decides to give to you? Why is that? To me, that doesn't quite equate, because you're performing a bunch of services for the buyer. You're doing the showings, you're running here, you're running there, you're getting them to the finish line. And what you get paid is based upon what the seller's agent, which you have no agreement, who the seller hired, knows nothing about you, has no dealings with you, but they decide how much you get paid for a particular deal. And that doesn't quite add up to me. And I think it also puts some buyer's agents at disadvantages, because it doesn't account for you going above and beyond and all the things that you do for your buyer to get a deal to the finish line. If you go above and beyond, shouldn't you be compensated as such? But with the current pricing model, none of that is taken into account unless there's a deal between the two agents have to decide what they're going to pay. But if you're performing your services for the buyer, then you should be structuring that deal with the buyer, and the buyer should happily be looking to pay you more. So again, I think a different compensation model that rewards you for that would be quite helpful to the industry and truly value what it is that you bring to the buyer. And because you're counting on what a listing agent is going to pay you, that also determines what homes that buyer's agents drive buyers to. I know this is something that you're not really supposed to do. We know it happens. You want to encourage your clients more towards homes that have a higher compensation, versus if there was a home that didn't offer any or very little, you're not encouraging buyers to see those homes. And because the industry has trained both agents and buyers towards this compensation model to do that, it's antitrust like behavior. And it's frankly part of the reason why National Association of Realtors, they're getting the pantsuit off of them right now, because it's antitrust behavior where listing agents decided not to pay you. You're not steering folks over there. I remember one young woman in the comments flat out said it, that if they're not offering any compensation, they don't show the home. Well, if you're working in the best interest of your buyer, and if that's the home that may work well for them, you're not showing it because you're not getting paid enough. Again, it just shows that the current compensation structure inherently pits the buyer's agents against the buyer. It indicates it's a broken model. I understand why some buyer's agents may do that. Everyone needs to get paid for their time. But unfortunately, the current model doesn't allow that to happen. So you should have a say in your compensation. And a way to do this is to get your compensation directly for the buyer. I think this will create more quality. And I think it would be better for the profession as well. Let's say that you have all these homes that you show 30 homes before your buyer purchases a home. Shouldn't you be paid for showing those 30 homes? That necessarily shouldn't come from the seller's proceeds for the other 30 homes. What does that have to do with me as a seller? The effort that you did for your buyer to show 30 other homes. As a seller, I shouldn't have to pay you for that time. that buyer should be paying you directly. And that's if you wind up with a sale. Let's say if you show 30 homes and they don't wind up buying at all, you should get paid for showing those 30 homes. I feel you should. But again, points back to a broken compensation model. And if the standard were for buyers to pay their agents directly for services provided, I think it would be a different story. And you get compensated for your time. And I think that you would avoid a lot of wasted time. People would show that they're serious about it. Now, another adverse effect, and I think this is what NAR and the industry in general is worried about, is that if we did go this route of buyers paying buyers agents directly for their time and their effort, I think the adverse effect may be people will avoid using buyers agents. I think that's the big issue. And I think that's why the industry has been holding on as long as you have for the current compensation model. You were to go and tell your buyers, okay, look, we're going to go look at these places and you're going to pay me X amount for every showing. Or let's even keep with the current model. If the standard is 3% and you, as a buyer's agent, you go to that buyer and you tell them, I'm charging you 3% once we buy, and it's going to be a closing cost, because we can add it to a closing cost, right? Why can't this just be added to the buyer's closing costs? But I think what you're worried about is if we add that 3% as a line item, and that buyer has to either come to the table with that 3% or factor that into the mortgage, everyone may not look to volunteer to do that. Or buyers may just say, you know what, I'll just go directly to the listing agent. And I think that's what the industry is really worried about, because you take a $500,000 house, 3%, 15 grand. Is a buyer really prepared to pay an extra 15 grand for you facilitating the transaction? Because at this point, the main role of the realtor is really to facilitate the transaction. The information is readily available to many buyers at this point to know the inventory and what's out there. So at this point, it's a lot of facilitating the transaction. So is 3% worth facilitating a transaction? If the value is there, we tried it, I think we have to be honest with ourselves here and say, oh, would most buyers be willing to come out of pocket to pay that? It's very convenient now for the seller to do it because 9 times out of 10, the equity is there. It's the money you never really had in the first place. So it's, I'll say, quote unquote, easier for that 3% to come from the seller. But if you had that buyer that had to cut that check, I think you'd have a different tune. And I think folks would really balk at paying 3% to have them walked through the transaction. Which brings me to my last point. I did a little research upon the history of the fees of your traditional or standard commission. So standard is today 6%. I think some will squeeze it down to 5, but just 6. Before the 40s, it was actually 2.5%. During the 40s, it went up to, I think, 5% based upon my research. And the standard went to 6 in the 80s. And I would imagine that before the information age, before the internet, I'm sure it was a lot harder to sell a home. The information was not as readily available. And I'm sure in those days, the agents and the realtors, they created the market. They were the market makers. So maybe a 6% split, however it needs to get split, may make sense because it's a lot harder. I'm sure there was a lot more work that needed to get done to match buyers and sellers. So I might be able to understand that. But in today's age of the internet, realtors are no longer the market makers. That's just the reality of the market at this point. The information is readily available. The MLS is online now, your Zillows, your Redfins, all of these information sites where people are looking for homes, they can quickly access this information. Or even if you're not using the MLS, brokerages now have websites. So if I'm looking for a particular place in a particular town or city, even if we don't have the MLS, I could select some brokerages and just go to their websites and easily see the inventory, or at least most of the inventory that's on the market. Point being is that the information is readily available to see. And our realtors are, for the most part, facilitating a transaction. They're no longer bringing buyers and sellers together. That's mostly driven by the internet. As this is the case, it does become harder and harder, at least in my eyes. And again, you can chime in if you feel otherwise. It becomes harder and harder to see where the value of paying a 5 or 6%, whatever the standard might be, does the value outweigh what that price may be? Especially when there are a number of other people that help facilitate the transaction that get paid a fraction of what you're paying your realtors. If we go back to our $500,000 home explanation at $30,000 across the board, 15 for each side, when you look at that line item as a seller, because again, this is all coming from your money, you're paying $30,000 to realtors. And then you also have other facilitators such as appraisers, attorneys that can very much help you through the process as well. And they're getting paid a fraction of what you're paying. So appraisers go for anywhere from $300 to $600, depending upon the market that you're in. And I'm sure most appraiser services, if you want to go deeper, you can do that, pay a little bit more. For real estate attorneys, you probably get a good one for, on the high end, $2,500, $3,000. And that's on the high end. It probably go as low as $1,000, $1,500. But even if you wanted to pay an attorney for a little more in depth, a little more negotiation, it's still a fraction of paying $30,000 when the information is readily available. So that's where my thought process was and my pattern was when I was selling my place. And I think that more folks are starting to realize that. It just becomes a lot harder to justify paying that kind of money, given the current market and the current availability of information. So this was pretty winded, but that's how I feel. I figured out a response. I think I covered many of the comments that were left. Just trying to be a little thought provoking. Please chime in. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So that's all for now. If you have any more questions about this topic or any other tax or account related questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help. Talk soon.